Hi, I'm Tom and I'm an antiquarian bookseller, and to celebrate reaching 3,000 subscribers here on YouTube, I'm going to be answering your questions today. So we're going to be talking about rare books and manuscript, what books are, whether I use ebooks, should we use gloves when we're handling books, and getting into the publication history of some of the most important and interesting books ever written. And to start with, Jake Amberson says, what are my thoughts on ebooks? Would I ever use one while traveling? Well, the answer to this might surprise you, because even though I make my living by dealing in physical books, I don't see ebooks as a threat to what I do, and I think that the two can and do coexist very peacefully together. Ebooks are a brilliant and really convenient way of conveying text to readers and researchers that want to use them. You can carry a lot of text without weighing you down, and you can easily search these texts to find the information that you're looking for. I use them every day while researching books, but the truth is, ebooks aren't books. And that's because the text, which is all an ebook is only one part of the physical book. When I think about a book, I think obviously of its text, but not only that, I think of the binding, its lettering and decoration, its end papers, whether there are any marks of a previous owner, how it's been decorated, how it's been sewn, how it's been typeset and arranged, whether it's been illustrated inside, and all of this is telling us about the history of not just the text, but this book as a physical object. Jessica Abel asks, I adore the smell of old books. Am I ever found sniffing books? Well, this is a really interesting question, and the answer is less romantic and more scientific. What we would normally call book smell comes from a chemical in cheaply produced paper that began to be introduced to the paper-making process and the book-making process in the mid-19th century. So when we talk about the smell of books, that nice smell people have when they walk into a Waterstones, we're normally talking about the detection of that particular scent. But when we're dealing with older books than that, if a book smells, there's probably something wrong with it. It means that mold or dirt or other unsavory odors have made their way into the book during its life. And so if I pick up a book and it turns out it smells, it's giving me a red flag, not a green flag. XX Lunticle says, are you an English professor? You seem quite knowledgeable about rare and obscure books. Well, I'm not an English professor. I don't claim to be. I'm an antiquarian bookseller, which means that I'm someone who deals in rare books and manuscripts. And I do this work at a bookshop near me called Yonkers Rare Books in Henley-on-Thames. And at university, I actually didn't study English literature at all. I studied international relations. And that's because I was and still am very interested in the history and politics of the Middle East. And my bookshelf with all books about the Middle East you can see behind me here. And what I was researching in particular at university were cultural heritage sites in northern Iraq and Syria that had been destroyed or were attempted to be destroyed by ISIS. So that interest in historical objects and artifacts obviously conveys pretty well to old books. But I also started while I was at university bookselling. I worked in a bookshop called Toppy & Company Booksellers in St Andrews, and that's where I found my absolute love for selling books, and I've continued that to the present day after my studies. And this is a related question from Jay Lewis. What do we specialise in if we specialise in anything in particular? And the answer to that is that we mainly deal in English literature in its broadest sense. So starting with Chaucer and Shakespeare and going all the way up to Harry Potter and the Gruffalo. And you might be wondering what a rare book dealer actually deals in. Well, there's first editions by famous authors, Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. There's also letters written by famous authors, manuscripts and drafts of their novels, entire archives of material by authors and illustrators, as well as original artwork that pertains or is related to books. But we don't just deal in literature, we also deal in travel and exploration, particularly polar exploration, and related to what I was saying about earlier about my interest in the Middle East, books about the Middle East and travel accounts of the Middle East. And we also deal in landmark books in other fields such as science, philosophy and history. User PX7 asks a question related to that expertise, which is about Ulysses by James Joyce. They say that you often see the first edition in its original blue wrappers with the iconic white text on it, but what about its original appearance in the magazine The Little Review? Is that valuable as well? Well, Ulysses has a really interesting publishing history it was banned and many publishers refused to take the book on. It was eventually published in full in Paris by Sylvia Beach of Shakespeare and Company in 1922. And its notoriety and small print run made it an expensive book very early on in its life. In fact, there's an amazing letter that James Joyce writes to one of his aunts, and his aunt disapproved of the book, particularly some of the sexual elements of the book. But Joyce wrote to her and said, look, I know you don't like the book, but it's trading for far more than it was originally sold for, so at least you can make some money on it. But the Ulysses controversy started, as our questioner indicates, when it was published bit by bit in a magazine called The Little Review. In April 1920, when they published the Nausicaa episode of Ulysses, the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, one of those great puritanical organisations, decided to bring charges against the editors of that magazine. The charges were on grounds of obscenity. There were obscenity laws in America then, just as there were in Britain, and these charges were upheld in a trial. So the editors were found guilty and the publication of Ulysses in their magazine was ceased. So if you can find the complete original parts of Ulysses, the parts that were published in the Little Review, then that can be valuable indeed. Sepp-esque asks, I notice you don't wear gloves while handling books. Is this normal and are there any exceptions? This is one of the questions I get the most, and the general rule for handling almost all books is to use clean, dry hands. Don't use gloves. I'm sure you sitting at home wouldn't dream of wearing gloves if you were reading a novel on the beach, and aside from how ridiculous it would be to do so, it would be impossible to actually turn the pages of the book. And that is still true for valuable books, just as it is for paperback novels. But there are some exceptions to the rule. If you watch my video that I posted about Thomas Cromwell's prayer book, you'll see that in that video, Kate McCaffrey from Hever Castle uses gloves where she's handling the binding of the book. And that's because the binding is made of metal. And when you're handling metal work, then general best practice in archives is to use gloves. But when you're turning the actual pages of the book, it's best to just use clean, dry hands. And we've got a brilliant question to finish from Trotter Tolkien, who's an expert on Tolkien and Tolkien collecting and is involved in the Tolkien Collector's Guide, so I definitely recommend checking him out. And he asks, why should people collect rare books? Well, I'm biased and I would never suggest that everyone should collect books, but it's certainly the case, and I firmly believe that everybody could collect books, and this is why. Whatever you're interested in and whatever you're passionate about, it is possible to build a worthy and interesting book collection about that subject. And that's because whatever it is that does it for you, there will be a printed history where you can trace the development and changes in that field and clarify it and give it coherence and structure by building a collection of books. Obviously, if you're really interested in a particular author, then you can collect everything they ever wrote chronologically, and there you have the corpus of their work. But let's say you're not interested in that, you're interested in a sports team. Well, you can collect match programs from famous games in that team's history. You can collect the original tickets to those matches. You can collect newspaper reports about those matches. You can collect biographies and memoirs written by the protagonists of those games, by players and coaches and managers. Or maybe you're into gaming. Well, even with something more modern like video gaming, there's still a printed history that you can collect. There's manuals and guides and magazines that can trace the development of a genre or a series of games or a manufacturer from the periphery, from being outside and cultish to being absolutely mainstream. And there are always categories like this, overlooked by collectors in our time, that sometime in the future it will seem perfectly natural that someone built a collection of rare books about them. And we can see this throughout history. There was a fabulous 19th century book collector called Francis Stainforth who decided to collect only books written by women. It's something that nobody else was doing, but what he created was a corpus of the published poetic output of almost every female writer in the English language, showing what they wrote, what of it was published, and how it was received in its own lifetime, and, importantly, what was available to a collector of those books while Stainforth was active. Thank you so much for listening and for your questions. Let me know if you have any more in the comments. You can check out what I do across social media and at Yonkers Rare Books, and I'll see you in the next video.